He knew he was going to die, not because someone had warned him, but because everything around him screamed it. He was tortured, humiliated, and saw his mentor brutally murdered before his eyes. He could have fled, but he did something no one expected, something that shocked even his tormentors. John de Lalande was just a young layman, unarmed, unprotected, and yet he walked toward his destiny as if he could already see something that no one else could. Today, you will discover the secret hidden for centuries about the last act of courage of St. John de Lalande. Stay with me until the end, because this story may transform your faith. The fine, cold rain trickled through the narrow alleys of Dieppe, tinting the uneven stones with a silvery sheen under the flickering torchlight in the night. The smell of sea salt mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread coming from a nearby bakery, and the murmur of the waves crashing against the docks seemed to whisper promises of distant lands. John de Lalande, still young, walked with determined steps, feeling the cutting wind of Normandy cut through the rough fabric of his simple garment. His eyes, though attentive to the path, were lost in thoughts that had been tormenting him for months. The restlessness of a calling that would not let him be. Since he was a child, John felt he was born for something greater. He had grown up hearing stories of the Jesuit missionaries who had crossed the ocean to bring faith to the wild lands of the New World. They told of cold lands, inhabited by unknown indigenous peoples, where hunger, disease, and death lurked around every corner. But they also spoke of souls thirsty for God, of the hope of conversion, of the glory that awaited those willing to give their lives for the mission. Each account inflamed his heart, but what truly drove him was not the desire for adventure. It was the silent and unshakable certainty that God was calling him to something beyond the safety of his hometown. The decision to leave was not easy. His name was not engraved among the members of the Society of Jesus, nor had he been ordained a priest. He was not a scholar, nor a preacher. He was a simple layman, but that did not stop him from ardently desiring to be an instrument in God's hands. He had heard of the work of the Jesuits in New France and their need for courageous men willing to serve as helpers, assisting in whatever was necessary, carrying supplies, building shelters, protecting the priests, and, if needed, facing any dangers that arose. It didn't matter what would be demanded of him. He was ready. The following morning arrived cold and foggy. At the port, John watched the enormous ships anchored, their heavy sails still furled, gently swaying to the rhythm of the waves. The vessel that would take him to New France was a sturdy merchant galleon, filled with barrels of provisions, tools, and fabrics destined for the French settlements across the ocean. The smell of fish and damp wood lingered in the air as the sailors shouted orders and dragged thick ropes across the deck. For John, this was the first step toward the unknown. His heart raced when he finally met the Jesuit priests who would share his journey. Among them was the renowned Father Isaac Jogues, a man of unshakable faith, whose stories of evangelization among the indigenous peoples were known throughout France. John felt a mix of admiration and fear as he shook the calloused hand of the priest. There was something in the Father's presence that imparted both peace and a silent warning. This journey would not be easy. The crossing was long and arduous. The ocean, which John had so often dreamed of crossing, soon revealed its fury. For weeks, they faced violent storms that shook the vessel as if it were made of paper. Gigantic waves crashed against the hull, and the salty water soaked the clothes and spirits of the crew. The nights were cold and endless, and the swaying of the ship prevented any true rest. Many fell ill, weakened by poor food and exhaustion. John, however, found strength in prayer. Beside the priests, he spent hours reciting psalms and asking God to grant them the grace to reach the promised land. There, on that foreign and hostile soil, his true mission would begin. The first stop was Quebec, an outpost that resembled a fortress surrounded by wooden walls, built to protect the settlers from attacks by the Iroquois. John stepped off the ship with firm steps, feeling the weight of what was to come. When he finally caught sight of the coast of New France, the young man felt a tightness in his chest. The sight was of a wild and unexplored vastness. Dense forests stretched as far as the eye could see, and the St. Lawrence River cut through the landscape like a silver blade. The wind carried the fresh scent of damp wood, mixed with the smell of smoke from indigenous campfires burning in the distance. The priests were received with reverence by their fellow missionaries, but it soon became clear that the situation was much more dangerous than imagined. The Iroquois, fierce warriors of the region, saw the French as intruders and their missionaries as threats. The path to the indigenous villages was fraught with deadly risks. Despite the danger, John did not hesitate. It was there that he received the news that would change his destiny forever. He had been chosen to accompany Father Isaac Jogues on an expedition to evangelize one of the most feared Iroquois tribes, the Mohawk. Few dared to venture that far, for those who had tried before were captured, tortured, and killed in unimaginable ways. But John showed no fear. If that was God's will, he would accept it. Before departing, he had one last moment of silence. He looked up at the dark sky, illuminated only by the stars, and felt the cold breeze touch his face. He thought of his family, of his home in France, of the safe life he had left behind. He knew that he might never return, but within him was an inexplicable certainty, a peace that came from unwavering faith. No matter what happened, he would never be alone. The next day, with few provisions and only faith as his shield, John de Lalande set off for the heart of danger. The young layman who had once heard the accounts of missionaries was now becoming one of them. And his story, written with courage and dedication, was just beginning. The cutting wind blew strongly over the St. Lawrence River, bringing with it the scent of the damp forest and the subtle aroma of burnt wood from the French settlements. The sky, tinged grey by the approaching winter, reflected the uncertainty of the mission about to begin. John de Lalande, with gloved hands gripping the handle of the small axe he carried at his waist, watched the last preparations for the expedition. The tension in the air was palpable. Among the colonists and the few soldiers gathering to bid farewell to the group of missionaries, there were murmurs of concern. Departing for the lands of the Iroquois was more than an act of courage. It was a leap into the unknown, where death lurked in every shadow of the forest. The young layman soon realized that the central figure of that mission was a man with a deep gaze and a face marked by scars from the past, Father Isaac Jogues. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes held memories of indescribable suffering. He had been among the Iroquois before. He had been captured, tortured, had his fingers cruelly mutilated, and yet had returned to France only to plead to be allowed to return to New France. For John, this was more than a testimony of faith. It was a clear sign that this priest was willing to do anything for the kingdom of God. It was Father Isaac himself who looked into the young man's eyes and asked him the definitive question, "Are you ready?" There was something in his voice that demanded more than a simple affirmative response. The question carried weight, responsibility, and a foreshadowing of what was to come. John knew that by saying yes, there would be no turning back, but he did not hesitate. With a firm nod, he sealed his fate. The journey began the next morning. With a small group of companions, they boarded fragile canoes, moving along the vast and silent St. Lawrence River. The rhythm of the paddles marked the time, while the waters reflected the immensity of the forests surrounding the waterway. The morning cold was biting, and the fog rising from the river created a veil of mystery over the path ahead. Every crackle coming from the woods, every unknown sound, made John press his lips in silent prayer. He did not know the dangers of the forest well, but he knew they were far from the protection of the colony. They were in the lands of fierce warriors, for whom every intruder was a threat to be eliminated. As they advanced, Father Isaac shared with John more details about the Iroquois and their culture. Contrary to what many French believed, these people were not just soulless savages. They were proud, courageous, and deeply connected to their traditions. Many, upon hearing the message of the gospel, became fervent Christians. However, there were also those who viewed the faith brought by the missionaries as a foreign poison, a threat to their way of life. Those were the ones who represented the greatest danger. The following days were a test of endurance. The canoes advanced against the current, and the missionaries had to alternate between paddling and carrying the vessels over stretches of solid ground, where rapids prevented crossing. The ground was slippery, filled with hidden roots, and John felt his muscles burning with effort at every new ascent. But the true challenge was fear. He knew that at any moment, behind any tree, invisible eyes could be watching. The Iroquois did not announce their arrival. They lurked, waiting for the right moment to strike, and when they did, they rarely left survivors. One night, while resting at an improvised campsite, John noticed that Father Isaac was kneeling by the river, his eyes turned toward the starry sky. The young man approached silently, not wanting to interrupt, but the priest noticed his presence and, without averting his gaze from the heavens, murmured, "I do not fear death, but I fear not being worthy of the sacrifice that awaits me." John felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never heard a man speak of his own death with such serenity. In that moment, he understood that the mission was not just a calling, it was an act of unconditional love. Days later, they arrived near the Mohawk village of Ossananon, where the challenges would reach their peak. The dense forest around seemed too silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The French did not know if they would be received as emissaries of peace or as condemned enemies. Everything depended on the state of mind of the warriors guarding the village. For John, it was like walking on thin ice. At any moment, the surface could give way, and they would be swallowed by the abyss. The sun had barely risen when they spotted the first signs of the village. Columns of smoke rising in the distance, indistinct voices cutting through the silence. Their fate was sealed. It remained to be seen whether they would cross the gates as friends or as prisoners. The sky above the Mohawk village of Ossananon was an oppressive grey as John de Lalande and his companions approached the limits of Iroquois territory. The exhausting journey had left their bodies weakened, but not their spirits. The path leading to the settlement was winding, cut by fallen trunks and dry leaves that crackled underfoot. The smell of damp earth mixed with the acrid aroma of the smoke from the indigenous fires, which curled in thin columns through the frigid morning air. John felt the tension rise as he realized they were being watched. No silhouette emerged from the dense forest, but the sudden silence of the jungle was a clear warning they were not alone. Father Isaac Jogues walked ahead, his face impassive, but his measured steps revealed the caution of one who already knew the danger that was approaching. John, on the other hand, felt his blood pounding in his temples. His instinct told him that something was wrong, but there was no turning back. They had come this far as envoys of peace, trusting that diplomacy and faith could pave the way among the Iroquois warriors. But reality would soon confront them with a far crueler fate. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed among the trees, and before John could react, a wave of Mohawk warriors emerged from the forest like living shadows. Their bodies were painted for war, their eyes fierce like predators at the moment of attack. They came like lightning, surrounding the missionaries in the blink of an eye. There was a short cry of warning, followed by the thunder of feet pounding on the ground, and then everything turned to chaos. John felt rough hands gripping his arms, pulling him down to the ground with brutality. A knee pressed into his back as ropes were tied tightly around his wrists. Father Isaac did not resist. He remained standing even as the warriors pushed him and tore at his travel clothes, exposing the scars of past tortures. The silence of the priest irritated the Iroquois, who expected screams, pleas, any sign of fear. But Isaac Jogues remained serene, accepting suffering as part of the path he chose to follow. John, on the other hand, felt his heart race as he tried to process what was happening. The cold ground beneath his face, the metallic smell of blood trickling from a cut on his scalp, the weight of the enemies on his body, all were a whirlwind of sensations that seemed to unfold in slow motion. But what shook him the most was the gaze of one of the warriors, who watched him with a mix of curiosity and disdain, as if deciding whether this young man was worthy of a swift fate or a slow agony. The group was dragged unceremoniously into the village. Mohawk women and children formed a circle around the prisoners, mocking and throwing ashes at them. Some children, encouraged by the adults, approached to rip tufts of hair from John and the other captives, laughing as the strands were scattered in the wind. The smell of meat roasting over the fires mixed with the pungent odor of dirt and sweat, creating a suffocating environment. The village, which could have been a refuge of peace, now felt like an arena of sacrifice. As night fell, the true trial began. The Iroquois believed that resistance to pain was a sign of honor, and for that reason, the prisoners were subjected to torture rituals meant to test their strength. John was forced to walk barefoot over embers, feeling the skin of his feet burn as he bit his lip to avoid screaming. The sound of wood crackling beneath him mixed with the laughter of the warriors, who watched every movement with keen eyes, waiting for any sign of weakness. When John stumbled, one of the Mohawk women poured boiling water over his bound hands, eliciting an involuntary groan from him. The cries were followed by more mockery. They wanted him to succumb to despair. Father Isaac suffered even more. The Iroquois remembered him as the man who escaped, and for that reason his punishment had to be exemplary. They ripped his nails off one by one while he remained in prayer, his lips murmuring words that only John could hear. The priest's unwavering faith was a testament to courage that John would never forget. In that moment, he understood that they were not there by chance. Their suffering was part of something much greater, a silent sacrifice that would echo through the centuries. John lost track of time. His body was covered in wounds, his eyes swollen from fatigue and pain. Every part of him cried out for rest, but he knew there would be no reprieve. When dawn arrived, the warriors gathered once more. The judgment of the prisoners was near, and John knew that his life now belonged to the whim of the village leaders. He raised his eyes to the gray sky and took a deep breath. Death was no longer a distant fear. It was an inevitable reality. But even there, amid the pain and horror, his faith remained intact. The seed of martyrdom had already been sown. The Mohawk village of Ossanenon slowly awakened under the pale glow of dawn. The chill of the season swept across the ground, covered in dry leaves, and the wind blew through the wooden cabins and tree barks, carrying the smell of ashes from the fires that had burned through the night. The previous day had been marked by the brutality imposed on the prisoners, but the darkness hanging over that place went beyond the cold or the thick mist covering the forest. Something darker was about to happen. John de Lalande, exhausted and weakened by torture, tried to keep himself standing, ignoring the piercing pains coursing through his body. His gaze sought a fixed point to avoid getting lost in the vertigo caused by fever and fatigue. He watched Father Isaac Jogues closely, who remained serene even in the face of imminent death. The priest's eyes were turned to the sky as if he no longer belonged to this world. His posture was not one of defeat, but of surrender. He knew that martyrdom was inevitable. The Council of Mohawk warriors had already decided his fate. For many among them, Isaac Jogues represented a harbinger of misfortune. His presence was seen as a threat, a shadow of the man who had already escaped death before. The more superstitious believed he brought an evil spirit with him, and allowing him to remain alive could attract misfortunes upon the tribe. The decision was made without hesitation. He would die that very day. By evening, John and the other prisoners were freed from their bindings and dragged to the center of the village. The circle of spectators had already formed. Men, women, and children watched that cruel spectacle where the life of a holy man would be reaped mercilessly. The warriors surrounded Father Isaac and ordered him to kneel, but he did not move. Instead, he stepped forward, facing his executioner with firmness. There was no hatred in his gaze, only compassion. The silence that settled for a brief moment was broken by the dry sound of the tomahawk descending upon his head. The blow was precise, and the priest's body fell to the earthen floor. Blood quickly flowed, staining the dry leaves around him red. But John did not look at the blood. He looked at Isaac's face, which even in death seemed to carry an unshakable peace. He had died as he had lived, surrendering himself entirely to the service of God. The crowd celebrated with shouts and gestures of triumph, but John remained motionless. An overwhelming weight filled his chest, not only from the horror of what he had just witnessed, but from the certainty that he was now alone. The only man who could intercede for him before the Iroquois was dead. The faith that sustained him was the same that condemned him. His fate was already sealed. As the warriors dragged Father Isaac's body away, John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew it would not be long before it was his turn. Time had become a silent enemy, and the darkness of the night promised to be his last companion. But even in the face of certain death, something within him remained unshakable. He would not flee. He would not renounce his faith. And so, the night fell over the Iroquois village, bringing with it a silence that John knew was only the prelude to his own sacrifice. Night fell over Osanenon with a heavy silence, interrupted only by the crackling of bonfires and the rustling of the wind among the dry trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and smoke, mixed with the acrid odor of blood spilled hours before. Father Isaac Jogues' body had already been dragged away, but his presence still lingered in the village like an invisible shadow. John de Lalande knew that time was running out. He remained seated on the cold ground, his hands tied, and his body covered in open wounds that still throbbed under the thin layer of dried blood. The warriors had moved away, satisfied for now with the suffering inflicted. But John understood the cruel logic of that game. He was nothing more than a toy for his captors, a piece in a ritual that would inevitably culminate in death. What hurt him the most was not fear, for by this point he had already accepted it, but the feeling of helplessness. He could not bury the body of his mentor. He could not console the Christians who in the colony were anxiously awaiting good news from that mission. His last action in the world of the living could not be a simple, resigned waiting for the final blow. It was then that he realized there was one thing he could still do. Despite the biting cold that made his joints ache, John began to subtly move his fingers, testing the knots of the ropes that bound his hands. The Iroquois had not reinforced the ties much. They were confident he would not attempt to escape. After all, even if he escaped the camp, the forest surrounding it was a deadly maze where every shadow could hide a lurking warrior. But John did not want to flee. His plan was different. In the center of the village, near the still living flames of the main bonfire, were Father Isaac's belongings. Among them, a small reliquary and a prayer book, objects he carried with devotion. John knew he could not allow those items to be desecrated. His heart raced at the thought of what he was about to do. He took a deep breath, pulling in the cold air that burned his lungs, and with a sudden movement, he tried to stand up. He stumbled, his weak legs almost giving way under the weight of his wounded body, but he forced himself to continue. Step by step, he moved slowly through the sleeping village, avoiding the shadows of the warriors who were sleeping or watching distractedly. Time seemed to stretch with each beat of his heart, and every sound around him was deafening. He needed to be quick. When he finally reached the place where the sacred objects were, John knelt down and extended his trembling hands to take them. The reliquary was cold to the touch, but inside it was something infinitely more precious than any wealth of this world. The testimony of faith that both the priest and he had carried up to that point. With his eyes closed, he held it against his chest and whispered a short prayer, offering his soul to God, should that be his last action in life. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the silence. One of the warriors had realized what he was doing. John lifted his eyes in time to see the dark silhouette of a Mohawk running toward him, the tomahawk shining in the firelight. There was no time to react. The blow was quick and precise. The cold blade cut through his skin violently, and the force of the impact made his body fall to the hard earth. The reliquary slipped from his fingers, falling just a few inches from his hand, now too weak to hold it. The sound of agitated voices echoed around him, warriors waking with shouts of triumph, but John no longer heard them. His gaze was fixed on the flames of the bonfire, which flickered in golden reflections. His consciousness faded, but his soul was no longer there. At that moment, before the darkness took over, he knew his mission was complete. The body of John de Lalande lay inert on the cold ground of the Mohawk village. The earth around him was still damp with the blood that had flowed from his head after the fatal blow. The silence that followed his execution was brief. The warriors, now animated by the death of the last of the prisoners, began a new ritual of mockery. For them, it was not enough to kill. It was necessary to humiliate the enemy, to reduce their existence to nothing. The younger ones were the first to approach. With spears, they poked the body, carelessly turning it over, testing if there was still life in those stiff muscles. Not satisfied, some began to drag John by the hair, pulling his lifeless body across the rough ground of the village. The scalp, already wounded from the tortures, was coming apart in shreds of flesh and blood under the merciless hands. An older warrior raised his bloodied axe and, with a precise blow, severed the missionary's head from the rest of his body. A trophy. The head was impaled on a stake at the entrance of the village, a clear warning to any other foreigner who dared to cross those borders. The mutilated body was abandoned in a nearby field, at the mercy of animals and time. For the Mohawks, that was the end of the invader. There would be no honorable burial, there would be no mourning, only oblivion. But God, who governs the times and destinies, had other plans. The news of the martyrdom of John de Lalande and Father Isaac Jogues quickly crossed the dense forests and rivers of New France. Christian indigenous messengers, horrified by the treatment given to the missionaries, brought the story to the Jesuits in Quebec. The account of their death was not received with simple sadness, but with a mix of sorrow and reverence. They knew that the blood of martyrs was never shed in vain. As John's body disappeared under the merciless cycle of nature, his memory took shape among those who had known him. The missionaries saw in him more than a young layman who had accompanied the mission. They saw the image of a true disciple, someone who did not hesitate to offer his life for Christ. Decades passed, and surprisingly, the land that had once been stained with the blood of the missionaries became fertile ground for the Christian faith. The Iroquois themselves, once merciless executioners, began to open up to the message of the gospel. Many who had witnessed the deaths of John and Isaac Jogues saw over the years the strength and testimony of the Christians and were gradually touched by that indomitable faith. Years later, some converted indigenous people murmured strange stories. They said that on full moon nights, the field where John's body had been left became strangely silent. Some hunters swore that, on certain occasions, the wind brought voices in prayer, as if the earth held the echo of the young missionary's last words. For the Christians who remained in New France, John de Lalande had not been defeated. On the contrary, his death was the seed of something much greater. The blood of the martyrs had fertilized that land, and one day faith would bloom even among those who held the axe that executed him. John's body was desecrated, but his soul was already before God, and at that moment, nothing else could touch him. Days passed, and the name of John de Lalande, just like that of Father Isaac Jogues, seemed destined for oblivion among the Mohawks. Their bodies had no burial, their relics were looted, and their sacrifice was met with indifference by those who had decided their fate. However, the story would not end there. Something began to germinate in the lands that had once been watered with the blood of the missionaries. The wind blew strong over the forests of New France, as if carrying with it whispers from the past. Time, always merciless, wore down the constructions of men and turned entire villages into ruins. But the memory of the martyrs never completely disappears. The blood shed in Ossanenon was not in vain. Decades later, the Mohawks themselves began to change. Among the Iroquois, respect for courage was sacred, and they knew how to recognize the strength of a true warrior. Even if their beliefs had led them to see the missionaries as enemies, the unbreakable spirit of those men who gave their lives for something greater than themselves planted a seed that could not be uprooted. Over time, the Christian faith began to infiltrate the Mohawk tribes. The same warriors who had once wielded the tomahawk against the missionaries began to listen with new ears to the words of the gospel. It was a long and unexpected process. Some of the indigenous people who had witnessed the deaths of the missionaries began to question the events. Why had those men not screamed in fear? Why did they accept death with such serenity? Those questions lingered like echoes in the minds of many. The French persisted in their evangelizing missions, and gradually new converts began to emerge. Among them, one woman stood out, Kateri Tekakwitha, the young indigenous woman who, a century after the martyrdom of John and Isaac, would become the first saint born among the natives of North America. She grew up hearing the stories of the missionaries who had died in Ossanenon, and was captivated by the faith they defended until the end. By the late 17th century, the Mohawks, who had once persecuted Christians, began to protect the new missionaries. Conversions increased, and Ossanenon, once a stage for brutalities, became a symbol of the victory of faith over violence. At the very spot where John de Lalande was killed, a chapel was built. It was proof that history did not end with the last blow of a tomahawk, but rather with the invisible work that God was performing in the hearts of those who had previously rejected his grace. Centuries later, the Catholic Church officially recognized John de Lalande as a martyr. His name was immortalized as part of the 8 Martyrs of North America, a group of Jesuit missionaries who had given their lives to bring the gospel to that inhospitable territory. His testimony became an inspiration for generations of believers, proving that faith can flourish even in the most arid of lands. Today, Ossanenon is no longer the Iroquois village that John knew. In place of violence, there is a sanctuary visited by pilgrims who walk on the land, where a young layman without sword or armor faced death with a courage that echoes to this day. The name that the Mohawk warriors tried to erase has become eternal. John de Lalande, who left for New France as a simple helper of the Jesuits, found a destiny he could never have imagined, that of a saint.